You cannot talk about violence in music without starting with the tragic, terrifying story of Phil Spector. In the 60s and 70s, he was arguably the most important man in music. He invented the wall of sound, produced the Beatles, and worked with the Ramones. He was a genius, but he was also a ticking time bomb. For decades, stories circulated that Spector was dangerous. He famously pulled a gun on the Ramones in the studio to make them play a riff correctly. He fired a gun into the ceiling while producing John Lennon. Leonard Cohen said Spector once held a crossbow to his head, but because he made hits, the industry looked the other way, treating his homicidal tendencies as eccentric genius. That silence ended on February 3rd, 2003. Actress Lana Clarkson was working as a hostess at the House of Blues in Los Angeles when she met Spector. She agreed to go back to his mansion for a drink. Hours later, a driver outside heard a gunshot. Spector walked out of the back door with a gun in his hand and allegedly said, "I think I killed somebody." When police arrived, they found Lana slumped in a chair with a gunshot wound to the mouth. Spector later claimed she kissed the gun and it went off accidentally, a defense that insulted the intelligence of everyone watching. He arrived at court wearing bizarre giant wigs to distract from the evidence, but the history of his violence was too overwhelming. The genius of the Wall of Sound died in prison, a convicted murderer who used his fame to terrorize people for 40 years. If Phil Spector was a slow burn, Sid Vicious was an explosion. As the bassist for the Sex Pistols, he was the face of punk rock anarchy, but his relationship with Nancy Spungen was a descent into hell. They were both severely addicted to heroin, living a life of squalor in the famous Chelsea Hotel in New York. Their relationship was violent, toxic, and codependent. On the morning of October 12, 1978, Sid woke up from a drug-induced stupor to find Nancy dead on the bathroom floor. She had been stabbed once in the abdomen with a knife Sid had bought days earlier. Sid was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. He initially confessed, saying, "I stabbed her, but I never meant to kill her," but later claimed he had no memory of the night at all. The trial was set to be the media circus of the century, but it never happened. Less than 4 months later, out on bail, Sid Vicious died of a heroin overdose at a party thrown to celebrate his release. He was only 21. The case was closed, but the image of punk's Romeo and Juliet remains one of the grimiest cautionary tales in music history. While Sid Vicious is a household name, the most violent story in music history actually comes from the Norwegian black metal scene in the early 90s. The band Mayhem was the center of a dark cult that involved burning down historic churches and worshipping death. The band's founder, Euronymous, was a manipulator who encouraged his bandmates to be violent, but he met his match in Varg Vikernes, the bassist for the band Burzum. There was a power struggle between the two men over who was the evilest figure in the scene. In August 1993, Varg drove to Euronymous' apartment in Oslo. An argument broke out, and Varg stabbed Euronymous 23 times in the head, neck, and back. When he was arrested, Varg showed absolutely no remorse, famously smiling at the cameras during his trial. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence in Norway. It stands as the most brutal, premeditated murder ever committed by a musician against a bandmate. Then there is the disturbing case of the killer, Jerry Lee Lewis. He earned that nickname for his piano skills, but many believe it applies literally. Jerry Lee Lewis was one of the pioneers of rock and roll, right alongside Elvis, but his personal life was a graveyard. In 1976, he was arrested outside Graceland, waving a gun and demanding to see Elvis. He accidentally shot his own bass player in the chest with a .357 Magnum, and the bass player survived and sued him. But the darkest cloud hangs over the death of his fifth wife, Shawn Stevens. In 1983, Shawn was found dead in their bedroom. She was only 25. Official cause of death was ruled an overdose, but the details were incredibly suspicious. She was found with bruises on her body, blood on her clothes, and the bed was soaked in methadone, a drug she wasn't prescribed. The crime scene was cleaned up before a proper investigation could happen, and Jerry Lee Lewis's clothes from that night, which were reportedly covered in blood, mysteriously disappeared. A Rolling Stone investigation years later suggested a massive cover-up, but the killer was never charged, taking the secrets of that night to his grave. While those stories are tragic, the story of Jim Gordon is purely horrifying because it involves a mental health battle that went unnoticed. You might not know his name, but you know his drumming. Jim Gordon was the drummer for Derek and the Dominoes. He played on the legendary song Layla, and even wrote the famous piano outro. He was one of the most sought-after drummers in the 70s, playing with John Lennon, George Harrison, and the Beach Boys. But Jim was hearing voices. He was an undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenic who believed his mother was a demon commanding him to destroy things. The voices eventually took over completely. In 1983, Jim went to his mother's home and attacked her with a hammer before fatally stabbing her. It was a brutal, confusing crime committed by one of the most talented musicians of his generation. When he was arrested, he told police that the voices gave him no choice. He spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric prison facility, a tragic example of how the rock and roll lifestyle can mask severe mental illness until it destroys everything. Sometimes the tragedy isn't murder, but gross negligence. Keith Moon, the drummer for The Who, was known as Moon the Loon. He was the wildest man in rock, driving cars into swimming pools and blowing up toilets with a dynamite. But in 1970, the fun stopped. Keith was trying to escape a mob of skinheads outside a pub in Hatfield. He jumped into his Bentley to flee. In the chaos, his bodyguard and close friend, Neil Boland, stepped in front of the car to try and clear the crowd. Keith, who was drunk and panicked, didn't see him. He drove forward, crushing his friend under the wheels. Neil died later that night. Keith was charged with drunk driving and driving without a license, but the guilt destroyed him. He spent the rest of his life haunted by the fact that he had killed his protector, eventually drinking himself to death 8 years later. We see a similar pattern of recklessness with Motley Crue's Vince Neil. In 1984, the band was partying with the members of Hanoi Rocks, a Finnish band that was just breaking into the US. Vince and the drummer of Hanoi Rocks, Razzle, decided to go on a beer run. Vince was drunk behind the wheel of his Pantera sports car. He lost control doing 65 in a 25 zone and smashed into an oncoming car. The occupants of the other car were left with permanent brain damage. Vince walked away with scratches, but Razzle was killed instantly. The crash effectively ended the career of Hanoi Rocks, a band that was on the verge of superstardom. Vince Neil was charged with vehicular manslaughter. His punishment? He paid $2.6 million in restitution and served just 19 days in jail. To this day, many fans feel that justice was never served. We also have to mention the Altamont Free Concert in 1969, a moment where an entire band made a decision that led to murder. The Rolling Stones wanted to host a Woodstock West. To handle security, they hired the Hells Angels biker gang and paid them in beer. It was a recipe for disaster. As the Stones played Under My Thumb, a brutal fight broke out in the front row. A young man named Meredith Hunter pulled a gun, and the Hells Angels swarmed him, stabbing him to death in front of the stage while the cameras rolled. The Stones kept playing for a few moments, unaware of the carnage. It is often called the day the 60s died, a moment where peace and love were replaced by violence and death, directly caused by the band's negligence. Finally, we have the super freak himself, Rick James. In the 80s, Rick James was the king of funk. But by the early 90s, his life had descended into a crack cocaine nightmare that was far darker than the Chappelle's Show skits would lead you to believe. In 1991, Rick James and his girlfriend were arrested for holding a 24-year-old woman hostage in his house for 6 days. The police report reads like a horror movie. They tied her to a chair, burned her with a crack pipe, and forced her to perform acts against her will. While out on bail for that crime, he did it again to another woman, holding her hostage for 20 hours. These weren't just wild parties, they were brutal assaults. Rick James was eventually convicted and sentenced to Folsom Prison. He served 3 years. While pop culture remembers him for the catchphrase, "I'm Rick James, betch," the reality is that he was a predator who used his power to inflict pain. From the drum intro of Layla to the punk clubs of New York, the music we love is often created by people we should fear. It forces us to ask a difficult question. Can you separate the art from the artist when the artist is a killer? Which of these stories shocks you the most? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark side of music history.